and racialized Muslim identity. The speaker is Ms. Iman Sadiq. Ms. Sadiq is a doctoral candidate in sociology at Northwestern University. She received her master's degree from Harvard University and an undergraduate degree at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor.
Thank you. So today I'll be discussing my paper entitled Coloring the Crescent, a process of hyphenization, the intersection of race and a racialized Muslim identity. So this paper explores the degree to which the racially diverse Muslim American community feels the repercussions of their racialized Muslimness, but comparing the experience of Black, white, and brown national Muslim religious leaders. Given that the Muslim American community is very racially diverse, the implications of the racialization of its religious identity are manifest in different ways for varying segments of the population. This paper demonstrates how the intersection of race and religion creates varying degrees of challenge for different subsets of the Muslim American community. Specifically, I ask, what does the experience of being racialized into a shade of brown tell us about the barriers to gaining full access to citizenship and social privilege? National religious leaders were selected because their unique position within the community affords them an in-depth knowledge of both their local community and the national discourse and challenges of Muslim Americans. In my sample, brown respondents included individuals from the Middle East and South Asia who were first or second generation immigrants. White respondents were Anglo-whites, all either converts to Islam or first generation children of converts. And Blacks were all native-born Americans who were themselves converts or were children or grandchildren of Black converts. So I'll now first get into exploring the case of brown Muslims. Brown here is a category which includes all individuals who are perceived as being from the Middle East or South Asia, being brown or shaded into brown, as is the case for white and Black Muslims, means individuals in this category lose to varying extents access and privilege. A key marker of racialization is this process of placing Muslims as being foreign outsiders outside of the American social fabric. So one respondent, Hamid, said, quote, Islam is seen as something that is, from 500 miles away or existing 500 years in the past, but it's not necessarily identified as something that is in the here and in the now. You tend to have a stereotype of Muslims being from elsewhere, not from here. And so we've heard this in many of the sessions and in the past years of the conferences, nothing due to the crowd here. And Hamid also relayed a story to me which I'd like to share with you all. He said, on the 9th anniversary of the September 11th attacks, I went down to the ground zero site. 3 men approached me in suits and they say, Secret Service has spotted you from the top of the building and they want us to check your credentials just in case. I said, just in case what? They said, I'm sorry that we're doing this to you. And I said, so why are you doing it? And the challenge is not just about my presence here, but more so kind of the validity of my emotions tied to that place and the events that surround it. I was in New York City on September 11th. I was standing in an area with 12,000 people as a second plane flew into the building, and I attended funeral services for people who are both Muslim and not who died on September 11th. And basically this guy, he's saying that somehow none of those things really matter by sheer fact that I'm a Muslim, and even though I'm wearing a uniform of a senior ranking officer, the fact that I have a beard and I'm wearing a kufi on my head somehow makes me suspect. As you can tell, I've changed the names of the people to pseudonyms. So even when they are in positions of authority, their status as a Muslim brings their loyalty to the nation in question. Hamid is a Muslim chaplain for the NYPD, which makes him a high-ranking police officer who wears a full uniform. His experience reflects the struggle many other Muslim Americans face as their loyalty to the nation is questioned, and they are monitored with suspicion even without a just cause. Due to his racialized Muslim identity, Hamid was otherized as a brown person, suspect of the potential to be a danger in such a situation as a result of his brownness, indicating an affiliation with Islam. His brown markers of his beard and kufi, the skull cap, indicate a racialized Muslim identity. So my intervention is a process which I assert to be hyphenization. I assert that experience of the racialization of Muslim Americans affirms a process which I identify as hyphenization. I theorize hyphenization as a process in which non-white groups are unable to make equal claims to citizenship as other Americans and do not have the social power to reconstruct the boundaries of the citizenship. Their claims to citizenship are not equal to that of white Christians who established the boundaries of citizenship and social belonging. Non-whites are identified by a qualification with a hyphen before the American when identifying their social group identity. In the case of Muslim Americans, their racialized religious identity lends them to the same process of having to qualify their identity as being Muslim-American and thus unable to make equal claims to citizenship, remaining vulnerable of having their civil liberties violated and their right to due process revoked. Another respondent, Ahmed, said, quote, "In their own personal experience, people do not necessarily feel any conflict between an American identity and a Muslim identity. A lot of American Muslim students, they live in a kind of duality. In a post-9/11 US, where Islam is in the hearts and minds of many Americans, unfortunately often associated with terrorism, violence, primitiveness, underdevelopment, and destruction, this duality is inevitable. So those who seek to claim an American identity become groups marked by a hyphenized American status, which denotes them as not having equal power and authenticity in claiming the privileges that come with a socially constructed concept of true American citizenship. Thus, they are always Indian-Americans, Muslim-Americans, and so on. Non-white groups are defined vis-a-vis the white Christian standard to which they aspire to attain." It also calls into question their Muslimness when they do make claims of Americanness. Islam is placed into question in relation to America. Can Muslims truly be American if they are Muslim? Hamid said, "It's policy that I think becomes problematic because you can walk down the street and people are entitled to not like you. I mean, what are you going to do? The whole world really isn't going to end up being your friend. I think when you get to a place where somehow now the social contract that I have as a citizen of this country somehow becomes secondary to someone else's by virtue of my faith or my profession or the work that I do stemming from my faith becomes problematic." Muslim Americans are denied the same rights of due process in the law and may be taken into custody without being provided a lawyer or even presented with evidence that has placed them under suspicion. Muslim Americans live in a duality, often being asked to choose one or the other, loyalty to one's nation, America, or loyalty to one's religion. Their identity has undergone hyphenization. Their racialized Muslimness places them into a marginal category of being Americans in flux. At times, they may be able to make claims to an American identity, but in an instant, this may be taken away as well. This is demonstrated by Sinan, who said, "The very fact that our American identity is questioned, no other group in America has their loyalty questioned." This threat of the infringement of their civil liberties puts Muslim Americans in a tension between their American and Muslim identities. I'll now explore the case of white Muslims, which you heard a little bit about from Juliet, but so this may sound somewhat repetitive, but there's a lot of crossovers here. So, Dawood is a white convert to Islam from California, and he shared that he was at Starbucks with his wife, who wears a hijab, and a man asked if he was a Muslim. When he replied in the affirmative, the man called him a traitor. He says here, "When someone like myself, a white middle-class American, becomes Muslim, amongst the white majority, that for me to go native in their mind and to accept the religion of the Arab, or at least in the United States, many of the converts are black Americans, that I'm a cultural apostate. And now given that we live in 2013 and I converted in 96, that obviously the days of the Jim Crow laws and separate water fountains is over. So there are people that might not articulate that or express it, but I think that many people, their initial reaction when they see me, because I choose to associate outwardly with Islam. Oftentimes the way they treat me is awkward or sometimes different. When whites become Muslim, due to the racialized nature of Muslims, they lose to some extent their whiteness. They fall into a shade of being brown, as their loyalties are assumed to be with their brown religion of Islam. In an American context, Islam is also strongly correlated with the black experience. Thus, for white Muslims, being racialized into a shade of brown means not only an affiliation with the Middle East, but also with the black urban poor. Their Muslim identity becomes most salient, and they are cultural apostates who face both explicit and implicit discrimination as a result. The racialization of Islam has resulted in Muslims having their loyalty as well as their pain as citizens of the nation in times of national tragedy brought into question. Bilal is a white convert who serves a very racially diverse community in Boston. He was uninvited from representing the Muslim community by the governor at the city's interfaith service for the Boston bombings held the day after the bombings, prior to the suspects of the bombing having been identified. He says, after the bombing in Boston, Americans for Peace and Tolerance basically went after me with a host of videos, and they follow me wherever I go. Fox News called me an Al-Qaeda operative and a Muslim Brotherhood sympathizer. During the bombing, I had no time to respond to those things because I was on the front lines here. When I was removed from the governor's speech because of the Islamophobes, no one said anything. We just got punked. As imam of the largest mosque, Bilal stood as a symbol for the Muslim community in Boston, which was placed under immediate scrutiny and surveillance following the bombings prior to any evidence having come to light. Despite being an equally affected part of the Boston community by the city's tragedy, their presence was denied, thus denying them the acknowledgement of their equal citizenship in the city and an acknowledgement of their shared suffering of Americans and Bostonians. Furthermore, some of his white privilege was revoked when he was shaded into brownness, being accused of being an Al-Qaeda operative. The experience of the removal of their privilege resulting from the religious discrimination that occurs when their religious identity is conflated with Middle Eastern politics happened even to white Bilal. Another white religious leader highlights the significance of this friction. He continues to say that when the white convert doesn't fit that definition of whiteness, then there tends to be problems, right? And that tends to be very difficult for people to swallow. I've seen people leave Islam because of that. Being a cultural apostate can be a jarring experience for whites who suddenly become immersed into a world in which they are now no longer able to control how they define themselves, but are subject to the scrutiny of others. Falling into a shade of brown does not completely remove all of their white privilege, but they do face religious oppression as being assumed Muslim and thus losing some of their privilege. John echoed these sentiments of the discord created by being both white and Muslim. He said, "They see me as a strange thing where I'm like this white guy who talks like a white guy and looks like a white guy and probably is into the same things that white guys are into, but also happens to be very committed to a religion that is more often identified, whether articulated explicitly or implicitly, with brown and black people and with foreign people from an American perspective. The racialization of Muslims is such that Islam is a brown religion and its adherents are viewed as being brown. Thus, even for a very white John, he is viewed as a strange entity. It is not understood why he would choose to abandon the privileges of whiteness and accept an identity as a Muslim." However, they are unique in that brown Muslims are unable to escape the racialization of Islam as easily as whites may be able to. For instance, Osman is a white Muslim and a religious scholar. He is an elderly retired gentleman dressed in a golf hat, a button-up shirt, and dress pants. The narratives he utilized to describe the challenges he faced as a result of being Muslim highlight his position of privilege. He said, quote, "There are inconveniences that people face. I myself, if I come into this country from a trip abroad, am almost never allowed to just walk into the country. And I know people that go through a lot more than I do in that regard. But to me, this indicates a serious threat to American democracy. But it's not a threat to me. It's not like they didn't put me against the wall and try to execute me. So when I compare what we go through here in terms of maybe discomforts, to me it doesn't count." Osman's framing of the struggle Muslim Americans face as inconveniences stands in sharp contrast to the narratives which brown Muslims utilize to describe their experiences. Perhaps due in part to his age and social position, he feels the challenges of Muslims are inconveniences and not necessarily major struggles. He acknowledges that his social position as a white man has placed him in a position of privilege to not necessarily experience these same struggles. In contrast, for brown Muslims, even if they change their name and do not don any religious garb or symbols, they may still be suspect of being Muslim and therefore brown enough and foreign enough to be excluded from the social fabric in the same way as other Muslims. For white Muslims, if they do not bear explicit markers that others may affiliate with Islam, they are able to cover their Muslimness and to some degree escape some of the scrutiny. So Bilal said, "I mean, I can dip into society and just look like your normal guy. In my experience as a white American Muslim, I can be almost like a chameleon." Though he can outwardly escape facing some of the repercussions of his racialized religious identity, whites may still fall under the same potential violation of their civil liberties or due process as a result of being Muslim. Thus, when whites become Muslim, they are not only viewed as cultural apostates, they become hyphenized Americans and unable to make, to some degree, the same claims to citizenship as other white Americans. I'll now get into the case of black Muslims. The racialization of Muslims falls into the existing racial order in which the stratified racial groupings continue to persist. Thus, the position of blacks as on the lower rungs of the racial ladder does not change and remains salient in the nature of their experiences. Ayub said, "One of the reasons why I probably experience less Islamophobia than others is that most people in American society will respond to me as a black first. For black Muslims, their black racial identity remains as the most significant racial feature defining their experience." Ali expounds upon the conflation of a Muslim identity being affiliated with brownness. "There's a joke I heard two African American imams say they had the problem of flying as Muslims, driving as black. Therefore, they stereotype them when they drive a nice car as black people, and in certain areas the police will stop them. And of course being stopped because of their name as Muslims when they fly. I believe that there's an issue of identifying people by their names, and we have all of these issues that people